They say love can bloom anywhere, but on Beauregard Plantation, it was a crime worth dying for. Samuel was a slave, strong and silent, his hands shaping iron while his soul stayed chained. Margaret was the master's wife, young, lonely, and tired of pretending cruelty was righteousness. Their eyes met in secret moments, a stolen kindness turning into something neither could control. When her husband ordered Samuel whipped before the fields, she screamed for it to stop. And that scream became the sound of her own undoing. That night, a storm rose, and a gunshot echoed through the barn. By dawn, they were gone. One wounded overseer left behind, one burning mansion swallowed by rain. Some say they vanished into the north, chasing freedom no one believed they deserved. Others whisper their names like a curse, because love that defies chains always leaves fire in its wake. He was born in bondage. She was born in privilege. Together, they burned a world that tried to own them both. Before we go any further, comment where in the world you are watching from and make sure to subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you don't want to miss. The heat from the forge painted Samuel's skin with a copper glow as sweat traced paths down his broad shoulders. Each swing of his hammer sent sparks dancing into the humid Louisiana air. Clang, clang, clang. The rhythm was as steady as a heartbeat, the sound echoing across the plantation grounds. From the shade of the veranda, Margaret Beauregard watched, her gloved hands resting lightly on the railing. She had been the mistress of Beauregard Plantation for barely 3 weeks, but already the weight of this place pressed upon her like the sticky afternoon heat. Samuel felt her gaze, but did not look up. He had learned long ago that attention from white folks rarely meant anything good. Still, something about the new mistress was different. She didn't bark orders like the colonel. She didn't smile at cruelty like the overseer, Harlan Pike. Instead, she moved through the plantation like a ghost, quiet and watchful. "More heat," Samuel muttered to Josiah, the young boy who worked the bellows. "This iron's fighting me today." The boy pumped harder, sending a fresh wave of blistering air into the coals. The metal glowed brighter, and Samuel lifted it with his tongs, bringing it back to the anvil. Margaret shifted her position, moving to a corner of the veranda where she could see the blacksmith more clearly. The colonel had warned her not to wander the grounds alone, but he was away in New Orleans on business. The house felt less suffocating when he was gone. Samuel shaped the iron with practiced precision. This piece would become part of a new gate latch for the main house. Another small thing he created that would outlast him, that would remain when he was gone. The thought always left a bitter taste in his mouth. The late afternoon sun slanted across the yard, casting long shadows. Margaret noticed how the other slaves kept their distance from the forge, giving Samuel space that seemed born of respect rather than fear. He stood differently than the field hands, straighter, with a dignity that all the years of bondage had not beaten out of him. Without fully deciding to do so, Margaret descended the veranda steps. She walked to the water pump near the kitchen house and filled a ladle. The proper thing would be to send a house servant with water if she felt charitable. The proper thing would never be to bring it herself. Samuel looked up from his work when her shadow fell across the forge. The sight of the plantation mistress standing there, ladle in hand, froze him mid-swing. "You must be thirsty in this heat," Margaret said, her voice soft but steady. Samuel lowered his hammer slowly. His eyes darted to Pike's cabin, then back to her. He said nothing. "Please." She offered the water, extending her arm. Josiah stopped working the bellows, his young face a mask of confusion. Samuel wiped his hands on his worn canvas apron and accepted the ladle. The cool metal touched his fingers where hers had been moments before. He drank deeply, the water like heaven against his parched throat. "Thank you, mistress," he said finally, his voice deep but cautious. He handed back the ladle without meeting her eyes, as was expected. But Margaret didn't immediately turn away. "You're making something for the house?" Samuel nodded. "Gate latch, ma'am. The old one's rusted through." "You do fine work," she said, looking at the pieces already completed. "I noticed the candlesticks in the dining room. The Colonel said you made those as well." Samuel's eyes flicked up to hers for just a moment, long enough for something unspoken to pass between them. In that fleeting glance was recognition. She saw him as a craftsman, as a person with skill and value beyond his labor. He saw in her eyes something he rarely witnessed from whites: discomfort with her position, perhaps even shame. "Been working iron since I was 12, ma'am," he replied, his tone measured. Margaret nodded, suddenly aware of how inappropriate this exchange would seem to her husband or any of the neighboring plantation family. A white woman of good breeding did not converse with slaves about their work. She did not bring them water. She did not linger. Yet she lingered. "The Colonel returns tomorrow," she said, more to herself than to Samuel. Something in her voice, a subtle note of dread, made Samuel look up again. This time, their eyes held for several seconds. Two prisoners recognizing each other's cage, hers gilded with privilege, but a prison nonetheless, his built of iron chains and brutal law. "Best get back to work, then," Samuel said quietly. "The Colonel doesn't like to be kept waiting." Margaret placed the ladle down beside the water bucket. As she did, her hand briefly slipped beneath it, leaving something small and rectangular. "No," she agreed. "He certainly doesn't." She turned and walked back toward the main house, her skirts sweeping small clouds of dust from the path. Samuel returned to his hammering, careful not to look at what she had left, until Pike crossed the yard toward the slave quarters, whiskey bottle in hand. Only then did Samuel quickly pocket the object, a small book, its leather binding worn soft with age. Night fell across Beauregard Plantation like a heavy curtain. In his cabin, by the faint light of a single tallow candle, Samuel unwrapped the small book, the Psalms. Its pages were thin as onion skin, the words impossibly small. Samuel ran his fingers over the inscription inside the cover. "To Margaret, may these words bring comfort. Father." His heart hammered in his chest as he carefully lifted a loose floorboard beneath his pallet and placed the book in the small hollow space. The danger of such a possession was enormous. Slaves caught reading faced whipping, mutilation, or worse. Yet the strange warmth of her gesture burned brighter than fear. Outside, crickets began their nightly chorus, 1,000 tiny voices rising into the darkness. Samuel replaced the floorboard and extinguished his candle. As he lay back on his thin mattress, he could still feel the weight of Margaret's gaze from across the forge yard, and for the first time in years, he wondered if someone else might understand what it meant to be owned. Dawn broke over Beauregard Plantation in pale streaks of gold and pink. The air was cooler than the day before, but the morning dew would soon burn away under the Louisiana sun. Samuel had been at the forge since first light, stoking the coals and preparing for the day's work. Harlan Pike slouched against a nearby oak tree, watching Samuel with cold eyes that never seemed to blink. The overseer's face was a map of old scars and new whiskey stains. His whip hung coiled at his belt, like a sleeping snake. "Put your back into it, blacksmith," Pike called, spitting a stream of tobacco juice onto the ground. "Colonel's home today. Everything better shine." Samuel nodded without looking up. "Yes, sir." He kept his movements measured and deliberate, neither hurried nor slow. Any sign of defiance would bring the whip. Any show of eagerness would invite mockery. The only safe path was the middle one. Invisible work, invisible feelings. From the wide porch of the main house, Margaret Beauregard stood watching, her hands clasped tightly at her waist. Her husband, Colonel Silas Beauregard, paced beside her, his silver-topped cane tapping a rhythm on the wooden boards. At 52, the colonel carried himself with military rigidity, his gray-streaked beard neatly trimmed, his voice loud enough to carry across the yard. "You see, my dear," the colonel proclaimed, gesturing toward the grounds where slaves moved between tasks, "Beauregard stock is the finest in the parish. Discipline is the key. A firm hand creates an orderly household." Margaret's face remained perfectly still, a mask she had learned to wear in her short marriage. "Indeed, husband." "Take the blacksmith there," Silas continued, pointing toward Samuel. "Strong as an ox, but gentle as a lamb when properly managed. Cost me $1,200 at auction. Best investment I ever made." Margaret watched Samuel hammer an iron bar into shape, the muscles in his back tensing with each blow. She remembered the brief connection in their glances yesterday, the silent recognition. Now, with her husband's voice in her ear, that moment felt like a dangerous dream. "You seem fascinated by the workers, Margaret," the colonel observed, his tone sharpening slightly. She turned to him with a practiced smile. "I'm simply learning how the plantation functions. As you said, a well-ordered household requires attention to detail." Silas patted her hand possessively. "That's my good girl. Now come inside. I brought you a new brooch from New Orleans." As the morning progressed into afternoon, Margaret found her excuse. She took an empty water jug from the kitchen and walked toward the forge where Samuel worked alone, Pike having wandered off to terrorize the field hands. "Mr. Samuel," she said formally, knowing others might be listening, "I wanted to thank you for repairing the broken gate latch. It works perfectly now." Samuel wiped the sweat from his brow with his forearm, careful to keep his eyes lowered. "Just doing my job, Mistress." Margaret placed the jug near the water bucket. "Is there anything else that needs repair? I was noticing the hinges on the garden gate." "Mistress," Samuel cut in, his voice barely above a whisper, "kindness toward me won't do either of us any good." Margaret stiffened. "I don't understand." Samuel's eyes flicked up to meet hers, then away. Pike watches. The house servants talk. The colonel has ears everywhere. He picked up his hammer again. A white woman showing interest in a slave man. Even just his work. It'll get us both whipped. The bluntness of his warning struck Margaret like cold water. Before she could respond, the crunch of boots on gravel announced Harlan Pike's return. The overseer's face was flushed from drink, his small eyes narrowing as he spotted them. "Afternoon, Mistress Beauregard," Pike drawled, touching his hat brim. "Something you need from the forge?" "Just collecting the water jug, Mr. Pike," Margaret replied smoothly. "And checking on the garden gate repairs." Pike's gaze shifted between them, suspicion darkening his features. "Samuel knows his place, don't you, boy?" "Yes, sir," Samuel answered flatly, hammering with renewed focus. "Well then," Pike smiled, revealing tobacco-stained teeth, "don't let me interrupt your inspection, ma'am." Margaret nodded coldly and walked back to the house, feeling Pike's eyes on her back like hot coals. Evening fell, bringing with it the heavy scent of magnolias and dinner preparations. Margaret sat in the parlor, embroidering by lamplight when the doors burst open. Colonel Beauregard stormed in, his face flushed with rage, a small leather-bound book clutched in his hand. "What is the meaning of this?" he demanded, holding up the Psalms book. Margaret's needle froze mid-stitch. The blood drained from her face. "Where did you get that?" "Esther was cleaning your dressing room and found it missing from your things. Then she remembered seeing you with it yesterday." The colonel's voice grew dangerously quiet. "She thought you might have misplaced it near the forge." "Silas, did you give this to him?" Silas stepped closer, looming over her. "Did you give my property the means to read? To fill his head with ideas above his station?" "It was merely—" "Answer me," Silas roared. Margaret flinched, but lifted her chin. "Yes, I gave him the book." The colonel's hand struck her cheek with enough force to knock her sideways in her chair. "You stupid, thoughtless woman. Do you know what happens when niggers learn to read? They get notions. They rebel. They run! He grabbed her arm, fingers digging painfully into her flesh. You've been here less than a month, and already you're spoiling the niggers with your city nonsense. Silas, please, Margaret whispered, tasting blood on her lip. It was only the Bible. Surely, God's word. God made them to serve, Silas snapped, and he made me to ensure they do. He released her with a shove and strode to the door. Pike, he bellowed. The overseer appeared moments later, as if he'd been waiting nearby. Sir? The blacksmith, the one my wife has taken such an interest in. The colonel's voice was deadly calm now. Tonight, after supper, you will teach him obedience. 20 lashes. Make sure everyone watches. Pike grinned. With pleasure, Colonel. And you, Silas turned to Margaret, will stand beside me and witness what your charity has wrought. Night fell over Beauregard Plantation like a suffocating blanket. The air had grown thick and heavy, promising a storm. Far off, thunder rolled across the Louisiana sky, a low growl of warning. Inside the main house, Margaret sat alone in her bedroom, trembling. Her cheek still burned where Silas had struck her. Outside her window, she had watched the terrible scene unfold. Samuel tied to the whipping post, shirt torn away, back exposed to Harlan Pike's merciless lash. The crack of the whip still echoed in her ears, the way Samuel had refused to scream, even as his flesh split open. The way the other slaves had been forced to watch, a lesson in what happened to those who reached beyond their chains. 20 lashes. Each one had felt like it was tearing through her own skin. Silas had stood beside her throughout, his hand gripping her arm so tightly it left bruises, forcing her to watch what he called the consequences of her foolishness. When Pike finally finished, Samuel hung limp from the post, blood streaming down his back. Silas had ordered him chained in the barn until morning, when they would finish the job. Lightning flashed, briefly illuminating her tear-streaked face in the mirror. She knew what finish the job meant. She had heard Silas and Pike discussing it as they drank brandy afterward. The noose was already prepared. Thunder crashed closer now, and the first heavy raindrops began to strike her window. The storm was almost upon them. Margaret glanced at the clock. Nearly midnight. Silas would be deep in his brandy-soaked sleep by now. Her hands stopped shaking. Something cold and clear settled in her mind. She slipped from her bedroom, barefoot, to muffle her steps on the wooden floors. The house creaked around her as the wind picked up outside. In Silas's study, she found what she was looking for. His pistol, loaded and ready in the desk drawer, and hanging on a hook by the door. The iron ring of keys that opened every lock on the plantation. The keys felt impossibly heavy in her hand. The pistol felt like judgment. Margaret paused at the back door, listening to the rain now pouring down in sheets. Lightning split the sky again, followed instantly by a deafening crack of thunder. The storm was directly overhead, nature's fury matching her own. She wrapped a shawl around her shoulders and slipped into the deluge. By the time she reached the barn, she was soaked through, her nightdress clinging to her skin, her dark hair plastered to her face. She struggled with the heavy wooden door, finally pushing it open enough to slip inside. The barn was dark except for when lightning flashed through the cracks in the walls. In those brief blue-white moments, she saw him, Samuel, slumped against a support beam, his wrists and ankles bound with heavy chains. His back was a mess of torn flesh and dried blood. "Samuel," she whispered, rushing to him. His eyes fluttered open, unfocused at first. "Mistress?" His voice was rough, barely audible. "I've brought the keys." Margaret's fingers trembled as she tried key after key in the locks that held him. "We have to hurry. They'll kill you for this," Samuel said, his eyes clearer now, watching her with a mixture of disbelief and something like hope. "They're going to hang you tomorrow." The third key fit the lock on his wrists. The chains fell away. "I won't let that happen." As she worked on the ankle chains, Samuel's hand touched her shoulder gently. "Why?" Margaret paused, looking up at him. "Because it's wrong. All of this. It's wrong." Another key turned in the lock. "And because I can't be part of it anymore." The final chains fell away. Samuel stood shakily, wincing as movement pulled at his torn back. "Run," Margaret whispered, pressing the keys into his hand. A noise from the barn door made them both freeze. Harlan Pike stood there, rain dripping from his hat, a lantern in one hand and a pistol in the other. "Well, well," he said, his voice slurring slightly from drink. "The Colonel's gonna be mighty interested in this little scene." He raised his pistol, aiming at Samuel. "I always knew you was trouble. Been telling the Colonel for months." Margaret stepped between them, Silas's pistol suddenly in her hand. "Mr. Pike, please walk away." Pike laughed, a harsh sound that bounced off the barn walls. "You ain't gonna shoot nobody, Mistress. Now step aside so I can put this dog down proper." "Run!" Margaret said again to Samuel, not taking her eyes off Pike. "Not without you," Samuel answered quietly. Pike took a step forward. "I'll kill you both, and tell the Colonel you was running off together. He'll believe that easy enough, the way you been looking at each other." Another step. Margaret's finger tightened on the trigger. "Last chance, Mr. Pike," she said, her voice steadier than she felt. Pike lunged forward. The pistol roared in Margaret's hand. The shot tore through Pike's jaw, sending him sprawling backward into the hay. Blood spurted between his fingers as he clutched at his face, eyes wide with shock. He wasn't dead. His chest still rose and fell, and a terrible moaning sound escaped his ruined mouth. "The horses!" Samuel said urgently, grabbing her arm. "Now!" They saddled 2 horses with frantic speed, Margaret moving on instinct, her mind strangely calm despite the roaring in her ears. Pike continued to moan in the hay, unable to rise. Samuel helped Margaret onto one of the horses, then mounted the other. "Stay close to me," he said. They burst from the barn into the raging storm. Rain lashed at them as they rode, thunder cracking overhead. Behind them, lightning struck a cotton shed with a blinding flash. Flames leaped up despite the rain, hungrily devouring the dry cotton inside. The alarm bell began to ring from the main house. Lights appeared in windows. Dogs barked, their howls cutting through the storm. Men shouted. In the chaos, Margaret saw Silas on the porch, nightshirt whipping in the wind as he bellowed orders. But the rain was their ally, drowning pursuit, washing away their scent from the hounds. The horses splashed through mud, heading for the tree line and the swamps beyond. Behind them, the cotton shed fire had spread to a nearby outbuilding, orange flames dancing against the black sky. They rode through the night, the storm gradually moving north ahead of them. By the time the eastern sky began to lighten with the first gray hints of dawn, they had reached the edge of the swamp, miles from Beauregard Plantation. Margaret slid from her exhausted horse, her legs buckling beneath her. Samuel dismounted beside her, reaching out to steady her. She leaned against him, both of them soaked and shaking with cold and shock. Behind them, a thin column of smoke rose in the distance, Beauregard Plantation burning in their wake. Ahead, the morning fog hung low over the swamp, obscuring the road that would take them north. The first light of morning painted the swamp in shades of gray and green. Cypress trees rose from the murky water like silent giants, their knees poking up through the surface. Spanish moss hung in ghostly curtains, dripping with last night's rain. Margaret stumbled forward, her fine shoes ruined, her dress torn and caked with mud. Samuel moved ahead of her, his wounded back a map of pain, yet he seemed to know the swamp by instinct. Every few steps he would turn, offering his hand to steady her as they waded through water that sometimes reached their knees. "Stay on the high ground when you can," he said quietly. "The water hides our tracks, but the mud is deep in places." Margaret nodded, too exhausted for words. Her hands were raw, Her feet blistered. She had never known such pain could exist in her body. Yet whenever her steps faltered, she remembered Pike's face as he aimed his pistol at Samuel, and her resolve hardened again. After what felt like hours, Samuel stopped suddenly, raising his hand. Margaret froze behind him, heart pounding. "There," he whispered, pointing through a break in the cypress. A small wooden structure sat on stilts at the edge of a slightly higher patch of ground. A hunter's shack, weathered and leaning, but with its roof intact. Samuel approached cautiously, circling the structure before climbing the 3 rickety steps to push open the door. "Empty," he called softly. For a while, from the smell. Inside was a single room with a dirt floor raised above the swamp water. A crude table stood against one wall, a broken chair beside it. Dried animal skins hung from pegs, and a small stone fireplace filled one corner, though lighting it would be too dangerous. Margaret sank onto the floor, her legs finally giving way. Samuel leaned against the doorframe, his breathing labored. "Let me see your back," she said. He turned, and in the dim light filtering through cracks in the walls, she could see how the dried blood had stuck his torn shirt to his wounds. "This will hurt," she warned, then carefully began to peel the fabric away. Samuel's muscles tensed, but he made no sound as she worked. When the shirt finally came free, Margaret bit her lip to keep from gasping. The lash had cut deep in places. Some wounds were still seeping blood. Without hesitation, she tore a strip from the hem of her once fine dress. "There's water in that barrel," Samuel said, nodding toward a rain barrel outside the window. "Might be clean enough." Margaret dipped the cloth and began to gently clean his wounds. Her hands moved with surprising steadiness. "I'm sorry," she whispered, though whether for the pain she was causing now or for all that had come before, she wasn't sure. "You saved my life," Samuel replied simply. In the distance, a sound cut through the swamp noises, the sharp crack of a rifle shot. Then another. They both stiffened. "Search parties," Samuel said. "But they're still a ways off." Margaret finished bandaging his back with strips torn from her petticoat. As she worked, Samuel explained in a low voice how they needed to hide their trail. "The dogs can track us by scent," he said, dipping his hands into the soft mud outside the shack. "This helps." He began to smear the mud over his arms and legs, then across his chest. Margaret watched, then did the same, covering her pale skin with dark swamp mud. It felt cool against her sunburned neck and arms. "My husband will have men watching every road north," she said. Samuel nodded. "That's why we're not taking roads. There are ways through the swamp that only the runaways know. You've helped others escape before," Margaret realized. A ghost of a smile crossed Samuel's face. "I fixed things around the plantation. People talked to me. I listened." The gunshots sounded again, more distant now. "They're moving away from us," Samuel said. "But we should stay here until dark." As evening approached, Samuel fashioned crude walking sticks from branches and showed Margaret how to use them to test the depth of the water before stepping. From a hidden pocket in his pants, he produced a small pouch of cornmeal. "Stole it from the kitchen months ago," he explained. "Been saving it." He mixed the meal with water from the rain barrel to make a simple gruel. They ate with their fingers, sitting in the doorway of the shack as darkness fell over the swamp. "How far to the river?" Margaret asked. "If we walk through the night, we'll reach it by dawn." Fireflies blinked around them, their light reflecting in the dark water. Somewhere an owl called, its cry echoing through the trees. "When I was a boy," Samuel said suddenly, "before I came to Beauregard Plantation, I had another name. My mother called me Elias." Margaret turned to him. In the fading light, his profile was strong, his eyes reflecting the first stars appearing overhead. "Elias," she repeated softly. "I'd like to learn my own name again," he said, his voice barely a whisper. "If we make it north, The simple statement broke something inside Margaret's chest. All the names that had been stolen, all the lives interrupted, all the families torn apart. Suddenly, the weight of it crushed down on her. She had been part of that system, benefited from it, even while telling herself she was different from Silas. "We will make it," she said, reaching for his hand. "And you will be Elias again." They set out as the moon rose, moving quietly through the swamp, following paths only Samuel seemed to see. The night creatures called around them, frogs croaking, insects buzzing, the occasional splash of something moving in the water. Every sound made Margaret jump, but Samuel's steady presence beside her kept her moving forward. As the eastern sky began to lighten, the trees thinned, and suddenly the swamp opened up to reveal the vast, slow-moving expanse of the Mississippi River. The water stretched before them, wide and brown, the far shore barely visible in the pre-dawn light. "There," Samuel pointed to a small dock hidden among reeds downstream. A weathered flatboat was tied there, and beside it stood a man, tall and lean, his dark skin creased from years in the sun. He watched their approach without expression, one hand resting near what Margaret guessed was a hidden weapon. "Morning," the man said when they came within earshot. "Lost, are you?" "Looking for passage," Samuel replied carefully. "North." The man studied them, taking in Margaret's mud-caked dress, Samuel's bandaged back, their exhausted faces. "I'm Jonas," he said finally. "Cross costs. We have no money," Margaret began. Jonas snorted. "Didn't ask for money." His eyes flicked to the gold buttons, still clinging to what remained of Margaret's bodice. 2 of those would do. Margaret's fingers fumbled with the buttons, tearing the last 2 from her dress. They glinted in the growing light as she held them out to Jonas. The ferryman pocketed them without examining them too closely. "Get in," he said, gesturing to his boat. "Stay low and quiet. Patrols on the river sometimes." As they climbed aboard, thunder rumbled in the distance. The storm that had aided their escape was circling back, as if to cover their crossing as well. Jonas untied the boat and pushed off into the mighty Mississippi, their journey north finally begun. The sunrise painted the Mississippi River in shades of gold and amber. Wisps of mist floated above the water like restless spirits, curling around Jonas's flatboat as he rowed steadily northward. Margaret sat huddled near the bow, her mud-stained dress now dried to a crusty brown. Samuel leaned against the side, his eyes constantly scanning the shoreline. "Stay down," Jonas muttered, his powerful arms pulling the oars with practiced ease. "River Patrol likes to stop boats around this bend." As if summoned by his words, a larger vessel emerged from the mist ahead. The Union patrol boat cut through the water toward them, its deck lined with blue-uniformed men. Margaret's heart hammered against her ribs. "Papers!" called a stern voice as the patrol boat drew alongside. A young officer with a neatly trimmed beard stood at the railing, hand extended. Jonas slowed his rowing. "Morning, Captain. Just taking these folks upriver a ways." The officer ignored him, eyes fixed on Margaret and Samuel. "Papers," he repeated. "All passengers must be identified." Margaret straightened her back, something shifting inside her. Years of training in proper behavior, the very cage that had trapped her, suddenly became a weapon she could wield. "Good morning, Captain," she said, her voice clear and confident despite her disheveled appearance. "I'm Mary Whitfield, traveling north with my husband, Reverend Elias Whitfield of New Orleans." Samuel remained silent, his face a perfect mask of dignified calm. "A reverend?" The officer looked dubious, taking in Samuel's rough appearance. "Yes," Margaret continued smoothly. "My husband serves a small congregation in the colored quarter. We're traveling to Memphis to visit his ailing mother." She touched Samuel's arm with gentle familiarity, as if they had been married for years. "Darling, show the captain your Bible." Without missing a beat, Samuel reached into his tattered shirt and produced the small book of Psalms, the very one that had nearly cost him his life days earlier. The officer glanced at it, then back at Margaret's face. She met his gaze with the practiced smile of a plantation mistress, polite, slightly distant, unquestionably certain of her place in the world. "We have letters from my father in New Orleans," she added, though no such letters existed. "He's quite concerned about mother-in-law's health." The captain hesitated, then straightened and offered a small salute. "Very well, ma'am. Reverend, safe travels to you both." He signaled to his men, and the patrol boat pulled away, leaving ripples in the golden water. Jonas waited until they were well out of earshot before letting out a low whistle. "That was something to see," he said, eyeing Margaret with new respect. "You got ice in your veins, lady." Margaret's confident posture collapsed as she exhaled shakily. "I've been watching men believe lies my whole life," she said quietly. "I just never told them myself before." Samuel touched her hand briefly. "Mary and Elias Whitfield," he said, testing the names. "Sounds real enough." They traveled in silence as the sun climbed higher, burning away the mist. Jonas rowed steadily, occasionally pointing out landmarks or warning of shallow water. By late afternoon, he guided the flatboat into a small, hidden inlet where a humble wooden church stood among willow trees. "Pastor James," Jonas explained as he tied up the boat. "He helps folks like you get further north." The church was simple: weathered boards, plain windows, a small cross atop the roof. Inside, Pastor James, a gray-haired black man with gentle eyes, listened to their story without interruption. "The Lord's work takes many forms," he said when they finished. "Sometimes it's prayer. Sometimes it's helping his children find freedom." From beneath the pulpit, he retrieved a locked box. Inside were forged papers identifying Samuel and Margaret as Elias and Mary Whitfield, free persons of color from New Orleans. "The Freedom Rose steamboat docks tomorrow," Pastor James told them. "The captain owes me a favor. He'll take you to Cairo, Illinois. From there, you can reach Cincinnati." That night, they slept in the church's small back room, exhaustion finally overtaking fear. Margaret woke once to find Samuel sitting by the window, moonlight silvering his profile. "What are you thinking?" she whispered. He turned, his expression unreadable. "About names. How strange it feels to have one I chose." The Freedom Rose was an aging cargo steamboat that had seen better days. The captain, a gruff man with a limp, barely glanced at their papers before assigning them a tiny cabin near the boiler room. "Keep to yourselves," was his only advice. The cabin was little more than a closet, with a narrow bunk and a small porthole, but it offered privacy and safety. For 5 days, they traveled upriver, the boat stopping occasionally at small ports to load or unload cargo. They spent most of their time in the cabin, emerging only for meals in the cramped common area. In those close quarters, they learned each other's rhythms. Samuel discovered that Margaret hummed softly when she was thinking. Margaret noticed how Samuel's fingers traced invisible patterns when he spoke of freedom. During the quiet hours, Margaret read aloud from the Book of Psalms, her voice soft against the constant thrumming of the engine. Samuel listened, sometimes closing his eyes to better absorb the words. "I never heard them sound like that before," he said one evening. "Like what?" "Like they were meant for everyone," he replied. "Not just for those giving the orders." Their bond shifted in those days, growing from desperate alliance to something deeper. When their hands touched while sharing a meal, neither pulled away too quickly. When nightmares woke Margaret crying out, Samuel's voice in the darkness steadied her. The steamboat docked at Cairo, Illinois, where a Quaker farmer offered them space in his wagon among crates of produce bound for Kentucky. They traveled by night, hiding during daylight hours, slowly making their way northeast. 2 weeks after their escape, their wagon rolled into Cincinnati just as evening fell. The city spread before them, buildings taller than any Margaret had seen, streets crowded with people of all kinds moving freely. They thanked the farmer, and stood together on a busy corner, surrounded by the sounds and smells of a city where, for the moment at least, no one knew their names or cared about their past. "We made it," Samuel said quietly, disbelief in his voice. As twilight deepened into dusk, a newspaper boy ran past, shouting headlines, "Slave Revolt in Virginia! Senate Debates Kansas Issue! Runaway Mistress and Slave! Reward, $1,000. Margaret's fingers found Samuel's, intertwining tightly. Her eyes met his, determination replacing fear. "We keep moving," she whispered. The first snow of winter dusted Cincinnati's rooftops like powdered sugar on a cake. From their small room above Garner's tannery, Margaret watched frozen flakes drift past the single window. The room was humble: a bed with an iron frame, a pine table with two mismatched chairs, and a small pot-bellied stove that struggled against the cold. Still, it was theirs. "Elias," she called, testing the name that still felt new on her tongue, "your coat needs mending before you leave." Samuel looked up from lacing his boots. After 2 months in Cincinnati, he was growing into his new identity as Elias Whitfield, a free man of color. His hands, once calloused from plantation metalwork, now bore different calluses from the Riverside foundry, where he worked 6 days a week. "I can take it tomorrow," he said, reaching for the worn wool coat. Margaret, now Mary Whitfield to everyone who knew them, shook her head and held out her hand. "The tear will only get worse in the wind. I have time before I need to be at Mrs. Haverford's shop." He handed over the coat, their fingers brushing. These small touches no longer carried the shock they once did, replaced instead by a comfortable familiarity that made their rented room feel like home. Margaret worked quickly, her needle flashing in the pale morning light. 3 weeks ago, she had found work with Mrs. Haverford, a stern but fair-minded milliner who needed someone with skilled hands to sew delicate stitches on ladies' dresses and hats. The pay was modest, but steady. "Will you be home for supper?" she asked, tying off the thread. "Unless Mr. Davidson needs extra hands for the railroad order." Samuel stood and slipped on the mended coat. "Church meeting tonight?" Margaret nodded. "Reverend Micah is speaking about the work in Canada." She handed him a small packet wrapped in brown paper. "Your dinner." Outside, the air bit with winter's teeth. Samuel pulled his collar higher as he trudged through the light snow toward the foundry. Cincinnati was different from any place he'd known. Crowded streets filled with people who paid him little mind, shops where he could enter through the front door, and work that earned him actual wages rather than just avoiding the whip. Yet freedom had its own bitter taste. White workers at the foundry kept their distance, some muttering when he passed. Free blacks eyed his southern manner with suspicion. He existed in a strange middle ground, no longer a slave, not fully accepted as free. Margaret faced her own challenges. Her accent marked her as Southern, making Northern women pull their children closer when she passed. At the milliner's shop, customers sometimes refused to let her touch their fabrics, fearing contamination from hands that had lived amid slavery. "Your stitches are fine enough, Mrs. Haverford had told her after one such incident, "but your voice carries memories some folks here would rather forget." That afternoon, Margaret sat by the shop window, working on a blue silk bonnet while snow continued to fall outside. Her fingers moved automatically, leaving her mind free to wander back to Louisiana. Was Colonel Beauregard still searching for them? Had Harlan Pike survived his wound? Sometimes she woke gasping, certain she could hear bloodhounds baying. When the shop bell rang at 4 o'clock, she carefully packed away her work and donned her threadbare cloak. Outside, the early winter dusk had already fallen. She stopped at the market for a small loaf of bread and 2 wrinkled apples before making her way home through streets now ankle-deep in snow. The tannery stink greeted her as she climbed the narrow back stairs to their room. Samuel returned shortly after, his face weary, but his eyes warming at the sight of her. They ate their simple meal in comfortable silence, sitting close enough that their shoulders touched. "I started a letter today," he said finally, reaching into his pocket. He unfolded a scrap of paper where he'd carefully printed 5 words. "My name is Elias Whitfield." Margaret smiled and touched the paper gently. "Your hand is getting steadier. I had a good teacher." Later that night, they bundled against the cold and walked 3 blocks to the Liberty Street Church, where abolitionists gathered twice weekly. The small wooden building glowed with lamplight, and voices raised in hymns spilled into the snowy street. Inside, they took their usual seats near the back. Reverend Micah, a tall black man with a voice that filled the room without effort, nodded to them as they entered. The congregation was mixed: free blacks, Quakers, radical Methodists, and a handful of others who believed slavery must end. Even here, Margaret felt the subtle separation. White women smiled politely but rarely sat beside her. Black congregants accepted Samuel more readily, but regarded her with quiet suspicion. A white Southern woman was still a symbol of the system that had oppressed them. After the singing, Reverend Micah spoke of safe houses in Canada, of brothers and sisters who had found true freedom across the border. As he described the perilous journey north, Margaret felt Samuel's hand find hers in the darkness. "The path to freedom is never finished," the Reverend said, his voice rising. "Even for those who walk among us as free today, the journey continues until all chains are broken." Heads nodded throughout the congregation. Margaret squeezed Samuel's fingers, feeling the calluses that told the story of his life: plantation, escape, foundry, freedom. As the service ended, people rose to share news and exchange quiet conversations. The church door opened, letting in a blast of cold air and a limping figure wrapped in a heavy coat. Margaret was reaching for her cloak when she felt Samuel stiffen beside her. "Don't look up," he whispered, his voice suddenly tight with fear. But she couldn't help herself. Her eyes lifted to the newcomer, and her blood turned to ice. Standing in the doorway, brushing snow from his shoulders, was Harlan Pike. His face was different, the jaw misshapen where her bullet had torn through it. A twisted scar ran from his ear to his mouth, pulling his features into a permanent sneer. But those eyes, cold and calculating, were unmistakable. As if feeling her gaze, Pike slowly turned his head. His damaged face revealed nothing as his eyes locked onto hers across the crowded room. The hymnal slipped from Margaret's numb fingers, hitting the wooden floor with a thud that seemed to echo through her bones. The nightmare had returned. The congregation rose to sing the final hymn, voices blending in the warm glow of candlelight. Amazing Grace filled the small church, rising to the rafters where shadows danced. Margaret stood frozen, her eyes locked on Harlan Pike's twisted face at the back of the room. Samuel gripped her elbow, his fingers digging into the fabric of her dress. "We need to slip out now," he whispered, his breath warm against her ear. "Side door." Slowly, they began inching toward the wall, moving between tightly packed bodies. The singing continued, most faces turned toward heaven, unaware of the danger lurking among them. Reverend Micah's deep voice led the congregation, his eyes closed in devotion. 3 rows from the side door, Margaret risked another glance back. Pike had moved closer, weaving through the standing worshippers. His damaged face remained half hidden behind a wool scarf, but his eyes never left her, cold, determined, patient as death. Samuel's hand found hers. "Almost there," he murmured. The side door was just steps away. Then the hymn reached its final verse. As voices swelled with bright shining as the sun, Harlan Pike pulled down his scarf and stepped into the center aisle. "Mrs. Beauregard!" His shout cut through the music like a blade. The singing died. Heads turned. In the sudden silence, Pike's voice carried to every corner of the church. "That woman?" He pointed a gloved finger directly at Margaret. his damaged jaw giving his words a horrible, slurred quality. "Is Margaret Beauregard of St. James Parish, Louisiana. She murdered a man and stole property belonging to Colonel Silas Beauregard." The congregation erupted in confused murmurs. Margaret felt dozens of eyes turn to her, staring with shock, confusion, and dawning horror. "And that man beside her," Pike continued, "is not Elias Whitfield. He's Samuel, a fugitive slave with a price on his head." Before anyone could move, the main doors burst open with a crash. 6 men in dark coats rushed in, pistols drawn. Their leader, a tall man with a trimmed beard, held up a document. "Federal marshals," he shouted above the growing chaos. "We have warrants under the Fugitive Slave Act. Stand aside." People scattered, some rushing for doors, others pressing against the walls. Reverend Micah stepped forward, hands raised. "This is a house of God. You have no right." A marshal shoved him aside, sending the reverend stumbling into a row of pews. The congregation gasped. Samuel pushed Margaret toward the side door, but they were cut off by 2 marshals moving quickly through the crowd. One grabbed Margaret's arm roughly, yanking her away from Samuel. "Margaret Beauregard, you're under arrest for theft of property, murder, and violation of federal law." "No!" Margaret struggled as the man twisted her arms behind her back. "My name is Mary Whitfield." Samuel lunged forward, but Pike blocked his path, sneering through his ruined face. "Remember me, boy," he hissed, drawing a pistol from inside his coat. Samuel's eyes darted around, seeking escape. Near the altar, a candlestand had been knocked over in the chaos. Its iron base lay on the floor. In one smooth motion, Samuel ducked Pike's aim, rolled forward, and seized the heavy iron bar. The marshal, holding Margaret, turned at the commotion. "Stop him!" Pike fired, the shot deafening in the enclosed space. Women screamed. The bullet splintered wood inches from Samuel's head. Before Pike could fire again, Samuel swung the iron bar with all his strength. The heavy metal connected with the nearest marshal's temple with a sickening crack. The man dropped instantly, blood pooling beneath his still form. "He killed Reynolds!" someone shouted. More marshals converged. Samuel backed toward the altar, the bloody iron bar still clutched in his hands. Margaret screamed his name as she was dragged toward the main door. "Samuel, run! Please run!" Suddenly, a small black woman appeared at Samuel's side, gripping his arm with surprising strength. "This way!" she hissed, pulling him toward a narrow door behind the pulpit. "Now or never." Samuel hesitated, his eyes on Margaret being forced through the crowd. "You can't save her if you're dead," the woman said urgently. "Come." With a last desperate look at Margaret, Samuel followed the woman through the door into a dark corridor. Behind them, more shots rang out. The woman moved quickly, navigating the darkness with practiced ease. "Who are you?" Samuel gasped as they ducked through a small storage room. "Clara," she replied without slowing. "Underground conductor." They emerged in a small courtyard behind the church. From inside, they could still hear shouting and Margaret's screams echoing through the walls. The sound tore at Samuel's heart, but Clara pulled him relentlessly forward into the snowy night. "They'll kill you on sight now," she said, guiding him down an alley where shadows offered protection. "You killed a federal marshal." Samuel's hands were still sticky with blood. The iron bar lay somewhere back in the church. They moved through the dark streets of Cincinnati, avoiding lamplight, ducking into doorways whenever footsteps approached. Behind them, whistles blew and men shouted. The hunt had begun. After what seemed like hours of twisting through back alleys, Clara led Samuel to a small house near the river. Without knocking, she unlocked the door and pushed him inside, quickly securing it behind them. "Basement," she whispered, lighting a small lamp. "Trap door under the rug." Samuel followed her instructions, finding himself in a low-ceilinged cellar, lined with shelves of preserved food. A small cot stood in one corner. "You'll be safe here tonight," Clara said, climbing down after him. "They won't search this house. Not yet, anyway." Samuel sat heavily on the cot, his hands trembling as the night's events crashed over him. Margaret was gone, captured. And he had killed a man, not in the heat of escape like on the plantation, but deliberately, with a weapon in hand. "They'll hang me," he said flatly, "and send her back to Louisiana. Maybe." Clara busied herself lighting a small stove in the corner. "Maybe not. You don't understand." Her husband. "I understand more than you think." Clara's voice was hard as flint. "I've been moving people north for 7 years. I've seen what men like Colonel Beauregard do to those who defy them." Samuel buried his face in his hands. "I need to find her. Break her out." "The federal holding house is guarded day and night," Clara said, placing a cup of something hot beside him. "Especially after tonight. They'll be expecting you." Samuel looked up, his eyes hollow with pain and determination. "I don't care." As the first pale light of dawn crept through the cellar's tiny window, Clara studied his face. "I can get her out," she said finally, "but it'll cost blood." Samuel held her gaze, his expression hardening. "Then, blood it is." Clara nodded, a grim understanding passing between them. "Rest now. Tonight, we plan." Outside, the city awoke to news of murder in a church, a fugitive slave still at large, and a Southern mistress in chains. The hunt for the killer continued as Samuel closed his eyes in the dark cellar, Margaret's screams still echoing in his ears. The rain fell in sheets, turning Cincinnati's streets into muddy rivers. Water cascaded from Samuel's cap as he adjusted the blue uniform of a Union porter. The stolen clothes hung loose on his frame. He'd barely eaten since Margaret's capture 3 nights before. Clara had procured the uniform, along with forged papers identifying him as a supply porter. She stood beside him now in the shadow of an alley across from the federal holding house. "The changing of the guard happens at 11, she whispered, rain dripping from her hood. "You'll have 10 minutes to get through the west entrance before the new patrol starts." Samuel nodded, his throat too tight for words. In his pocket, a small iron rod waited, heated earlier until the end glowed like a small sun, then wrapped in wet cloth to hold its heat. "If you're not out by midnight, I'll assume the worst," Clara continued. "The boat won't wait." "We'll be there," Samuel said, his voice low and certain. Clara pressed his arm. "God go with you." Then she melted back into the shadows. Samuel crossed the street, splashing through ankle-deep water. The holding house loomed above him, its windows barred and dark. 2 guards stood under the shelter of the main entrance, stamping their feet against the cold. He approached with measured steps, shoulders slightly hunched, eyes downcast, the posture of a man who wished to remain invisible. The papers in his pocket claimed he was delivering medical supplies. "Halt!" the first guard called, raising a lantern. "State your business." Samuel kept his head low. "Medical supplies, sir. Dr. Morton's orders." He produced the forged papers, letting rain smudge the ink slightly. The guard squinted at the paper, then at Samuel. "Awful late for deliveries." "Fever medicine, sir. Doctor says it's urgent." The second guard shifted impatiently. "Let him through, Carter. I'm freezing my ass off out here." After a moment's hesitation, the first guard nodded toward the door. "Make it quick." Samuel ducked inside, careful not to move too quickly or seem too eager. The building's interior smelled of damp stone and unwashed bodies. A corridor stretched before him, lit by gas lamps that cast flickering shadows on the walls. He followed Clara's directions, turning left at the first junction, then right at the second. The basement cells lay at the end of a narrow staircase. 2 guards usually watched it, but tonight, if Clara's information was correct, one would be making rounds, leaving only a single man to overcome. At the stairwell, Samuel paused, listening. Heavy boots echoed on stone, moving away. He peered around the corner. A single guard sat at a desk, head drooping with sleep. Samuel slipped the iron rod from his pocket, unwrapping it carefully, still hot to the touch. In a single fluid motion, he moved behind the guard and struck him hard at the base of the skull. The man slumped forward without a sound. Keys jangled at the guard's belt. Samuel took them, then dragged the unconscious man into a storage closet. He locked the door from outside and descended the stairs. The basement corridor stretched long and dark, cells lining both sides. Most stood empty. The holding house mainly processed fugitives before sending them south. A single lamp burned at the far end, casting just enough light to see. "Margaret?" Samuel whispered, moving from cell to cell. "Margaret, it's me." A soft moan answered him from the last cell. Samuel rushed forward, keys ready. Margaret lay curled on a thin pallet, her dress torn and filthy. When she looked up, her face was bruised, one eye swollen nearly shut. "Samuel?" Her voice cracked with disbelief. "Is it really you?" "I'm here." His hands shook as he found the right key. "I'm getting you out." The lock clicked open. Samuel knelt beside her, gently helping her sit up. She felt so thin beneath his hands, as though she might break at his touch. "They said you were dead," she whispered. "Pike told me they found your body in the river." "He lied." Samuel wrapped his coat around her shoulders. "Can you walk?" Margaret nodded, though pain flashed across her face as she stood. Samuel steadied her, his arm around her waist. A voice echoed suddenly from the corridor above. Harlan Pike's unmistakable slurred speech, damaged from Margaret's bullet months ago. "Check the woman again," he was saying. "Colonel Beauregard's man arrives tomorrow to escort her south." Samuel tensed. Margaret's fingers dug into his arm. "Hide," she breathed, but there was nowhere to go. Samuel pressed Margaret back into the shadows of the cell and positioned himself beside the stairs, the iron rod gripped tight in his hand. Footsteps descended. First came a guard Samuel hadn't seen before, then Harlan Pike, his scarred face contorted in its permanent grimace. The guard frowned at the empty desk. "Where's Wilson?" Before Pike could answer, the guard continued toward the cells. "Probably taking a piss again. I'll check on the woman." Pike remained at the bottom of the stairs, scanning the corridor with suspicious eyes. For a moment, he stood directly beside Samuel's hiding place, close enough that Samuel could smell tobacco and whiskey on his breath. When the guard reached Margaret's cell and found it open, he shouted, "Sir, she's gone!" Pike spun around, reaching for his pistol. In that instant, Samuel struck. The iron rod connected with Pike's arm, sending the pistol clattering across the floor. Pike howled, recognition and hatred flashing in his eyes. "You!" he spat. Samuel didn't hesitate. He drove Pike against the wall, pressing the hot end of the iron rod against the overseer's throat. The same brand that had once marked Samuel's skin now seared Pike's flesh. Pike's scream died to a gurgle as his windpipe collapsed under the burning metal. His eyes bulged, fingers clawing uselessly at Samuel's arms. Then he went limp, sliding down the wall. The guard rushed forward, drawing his own weapon. Samuel swung the rod again, catching him across the temple. The man dropped heavily beside Pike. Margaret emerged from the shadows, her good eye wide with shock. "We need to move," Samuel said, taking her hand. "Now." He led her past the bodies, up the stairs, and through a service door Clara had marked on a crude map. It opened to a narrow passage that connected to the city's sewer system. The stench hit them like a wall as they entered the dark tunnel. Samuel produced a small lantern from inside his stolen uniform and lit it, revealing brick walls streaked with slime and a channel of foul water running down the center. "This way," he said, pointing to a white chalk mark on the wall. Clara's signal. They followed the marks, splashing through ankle-deep filth. Margaret stumbled often, her strength fading, but Samuel's arm never left her waist. "Almost there," he whispered when she faltered. "Stay with me, Margaret." After what seemed like hours, they reached a rusted ladder leading to a street grate. Samuel climbed first, pushing against the heavy iron cover until it gave way. Rain poured through the opening, washing away some of the sewer's stench. He helped Margaret up, lifting her the last few rungs when her arms gave out. They emerged into an alley behind a tannery, the smell of leather and chemicals mingling with the clean scent of rain. At the alley's end, a covered wagon waited. Clara sat on the driver's seat, her face tight with anxiety. "Thank God," she breathed when she saw them. "Quickly now." Samuel lifted Margaret into the wagon bed, where blankets and dry clothes waited. Clara snapped the reins, and the horse moved forward, splashing through puddles. "The alarm's been raised," she said, as they turned onto a main street. "They found the guard you locked up. Every lawman in the city will be looking for you by dawn." Samuel held Margaret close, feeling her shiver against him despite the blankets. "The boat?" "Waiting," Clara confirmed. "Captain's an old friend. He'll take you all the way to Detroit if the weather holds." Through rain-slicked streets, they made their way toward the Ohio River. Police whistles sounded in the distance, but Clara navigated side streets and alleys with the confidence of someone who had made this journey many times before. Finally, the river came into view, a dark, swollen mass moving relentlessly northward. A small steamboat waited at a private dock, its lights dimmed, thin smoke rising from its stack. "There's your passage to freedom," Clara said softly. "God speed you both." A harsh wind cut across the Detroit River, carrying ice crystals that stung like needles against exposed skin. The pre-dawn darkness made the half-frozen water look like black glass, cracked and dangerous. Margaret leaned heavily against Samuel, her wounded body shivering despite the layers of wool blankets Clara had wrapped around her shoulders. "Can you stand?" Samuel asked, his breath forming clouds in the bitter air. Margaret nodded weakly. "I can make it." Her voice was thin, but determined. Clara worked quickly at the shore, testing the ice with a long pole. The Detroit River, their final barrier to freedom, stretched about half a mile across. In summer, they would have needed a boat. In the dead of winter, the ice would have been solid enough to walk across. But January had brought unpredictable thaws and freezes, leaving the surface treacherous, solid in patches, dangerously thin in others. "Follow my exact path," Clara instructed, her dark eyes serious. "Step only where I step. The ice near shore is strongest. The middle channel still flows. We'll have to use the ice bridges." Samuel helped Margaret to her feet. 3 days in the federal holding house had left her weak and feverish. The bruises on her face stood out starkly against her pale skin. He worried she wouldn't make it, but said nothing. They had no choice but to cross now. "Ready?" Clara asked, checking the pistol tucked in her belt one last time. Samuel nodded. "Ready." Clara stepped onto the ice first, testing each footfall before committing her weight. Samuel guided Margaret, supporting most of her weight as they followed Clara's path. The ice creaked beneath them, a low, threatening sound that made Samuel's heart race. They were perhaps 50 yards from shore when Clara suddenly froze, raising her hand for them to stop. Samuel heard it too, the crunch of boots on snow coming from the tree line behind them. "Down!" Clara whispered sharply. They dropped low. Margaret bit her lip to keep from crying out as her injured body hit the ice. Through the dim light, Samuel could make out 4 men emerging from the woods, rifles in hand. "Bounty hunters." "How did they find us?" Margaret whispered. Clara's expression hardened. "Doesn't matter now. We run." They abandoned caution. Clara led them forward at a quick pace, no longer testing each step. The ice popped and groaned beneath them. Behind them, a shout went up. "There they are!" A rifle shot cracked through the cold air. The bullet struck ice near Clara's feet, sending up a spray of frozen shards. Clara drew her pistol and turned, firing back. One of the men yelled and fell. The others scattered, taking cover among the shoreline trees. "Move!" she shouted to Samuel and Margaret. "Get to the middle channel." They half ran, half slid across the ice. Margaret stumbled, her strength failing. Samuel caught her before she fell, practically carrying her now. The middle of the river loomed ahead, a 30-foot gap of black flowing water with only a narrow ice bridge spanning it. Clara reached it first, dropping to her hands and knees to distribute her weight as she crawled across. More shots rang out. The bounty hunters had regrouped, advancing steadily across the ice. Clara made it to the other side of the channel and turned, firing her pistol again to give them cover. Samuel helped Margaret onto the ice bridge. "Crawl!" he urged. "I'm right behind you." Margaret began to move across the narrow span, her breath coming in painful gasps. Samuel followed, the ice shifting beneath their combined weight. A bullet whistled overhead. They were halfway across when Samuel heard one of the hunters shouting orders to the others. "Circle around! Cut them off at the far shore!" Clara heard it too. "Hurry!" she called, firing her last shots toward the men. Margaret reached the far side. Samuel was just behind her when another shot cracked through the air. He looked up to see a bounty hunter standing much closer than the others, his rifle aimed directly at Samuel's chest. The man fired. In that same instant, Margaret threw herself in front of Samuel. The bullet struck her shoulder with a sickening thud. She crumpled against him, blood quickly soaking through her coat. "No!" Samuel screamed, catching her before she slid into the water. Clara rushed forward, grabbing Margaret's other side. "Get her across! Now!" Together they pulled Margaret over the edge of the ice onto more solid ground. Samuel lifted her into his arms. Her eyes fluttered, but she was conscious, her breath coming in shallow pants. "Run!" Clara commanded, shoving them forward. "I'll hold them off." "But," Samuel began. "Go!" Clara turned back toward the bounty hunters, her empty pistol raised like she still had bullets. "Canada is less than a quarter-mile. Go!" Samuel ran, Margaret cradled against his chest. The ice beneath his feet cracked with each step. Behind him, Clara's shouts and the hunters' angry replies grew fainter. Another gunshot echoed across the frozen expanse. The eastern sky was beginning to lighten, a faint gray glow spreading along the horizon. Samuel could see the opposite shore now, the Canadian side, where no slave-catcher's law could touch them. Freedom, so close yet terribly far, with Margaret bleeding in his arms. His foot broke through a thin patch of ice, plunging into freezing water up to his knee. He pulled free, gasping, and kept moving. Margaret's eyes opened briefly. "Almost there," she whispered. "Save your strength," Samuel told her, pressing on. The shore grew closer. The ice became solid again as the water grew shallower. Samuel's legs burned with exhaustion, but he refused to slow. Margaret's blood had soaked through his shirt, warm against his chest, despite the freezing air. Behind them, Clara's gunfire had stopped entirely. Samuel didn't look back. He couldn't. With a final burst of desperate energy, Samuel climbed the gentle slope of the Canadian shore. His feet touched solid ground. Not ice, not American soil, but free Canadian earth. He staggered forward a few more steps before his legs gave out. They collapsed together onto the frozen ground, gasping for breath. Margaret's face was alarmingly pale, but her eyes were open, aware. The wound in her shoulder continued to bleed, but not as heavily as before. In the distance, a church bell began to ring, marking the early hour. The sound carried clearly across the still winter air, sweet and pure. The first rays of dawn burned faintly through the clouds, casting a pale golden light across the snow. Samuel looked back toward the river. There was no sign of Clara or the bounty hunters, only the vast stretch of ice and water separating them from the land of their bondage. "We made it," Samuel whispered, his voice breaking with exhaustion and disbelief. Margaret's fingers weakly squeezed his. The wind blew across them, cold and silent, carrying no answer except the promise of a new day in a new land. 2 months later, Early spring sunshine poured across the melting snow near Lake Erie. Ice still clung to the shoreline in patches, but each day brought more bare ground and the first hints of green. In a small cabin set back from the water, Samuel worked at his forge, hammering red-hot iron into shape. The rhythmic clanging echoed across the clearing, a sound of creation rather than bondage. Inside the cabin, Margaret sat by the window, needle flashing through fabric as she completed mending for a neighbor. Her left shoulder still ached when rain threatened, a permanent reminder of the bullet she had taken. The wound had healed slowly, but well, leaving a puckered scar beneath her dress. They lived simply as Mr. and Mrs. Whitfield. Their small property included the cabin, the forge, and a patch of garden where Margaret had begun turning soil for spring planting. Few questioned their story. A free black craftsman and his quiet wife who had moved north for better opportunities. In a community of fishermen, farmers, and other skilled workers, they blended in through their usefulness and their careful privacy. A knock at the door pulled Margaret from her sewing. She set aside the fabric and crossed the room carefully. Even after 2 months of recovery, she moved with deliberate steps. "Good morning, Mrs. Whitfield," the postmaster's son said when she opened the door. He held out an envelope. "Mailboat came in from Detroit." "Thank you, Thomas," Margaret replied, taking the envelope. Her voice carried only the faintest trace of her southern accent now. After the boy left, Margaret examined the letter. It bore no return address, but the handwriting looked familiar. Her heart quickened. She brought the envelope to her nose, catching the faint scent of lavender oil. "Samuel," she called, moving to the door of the cabin. Samuel set down his hammer and stepped from the small forge into the spring sunshine. His forearms glistened with sweat, despite the cool air. "What is it?" Margaret held up the envelope. "A letter." "I think it's from Clara." Samuel quickly wiped his hands on a cloth and joined her inside. They sat together at the small table as Margaret carefully opened the envelope. Inside was a single sheet of paper, folded around several newspaper clippings and a smaller slip of paper. "Dear friends," Margaret read aloud, "I pray this finds you well and healing. The crossing that day was difficult, but I made it back safely. 2 of our pursuers drowned when the ice broke. The others retreated. I've continued our work. 23 souls have crossed since you left. Enclosed are their names, so you may know you were not alone." Samuel unfolded the smaller slip of paper. 23 names were written in neat rows. Some had markings beside them. Families traveling together. He ran his finger over the list, feeling a connection to people he would likely never meet, but with whom he shared the experience of flight and freedom. Margaret continued reading. "The war grows hotter. They say Mr. Lincoln may free the slaves to punish the rebels. I do not know if this is true, but I pray it is. Be safe, dear friends. Perhaps someday we will meet in better times. Until then, I remain your faithful conductor. C." Samuel took the letter when she finished, studying it as if it might contain more meaning between the lines. 23, he said softly. "She's a brave woman." "She saved our lives," Margaret replied, touching her scarred shoulder absently. Samuel nodded and began examining the newspaper clippings. Most were about the war. Battles fought, territories gained and lost. But one, dated just 2 weeks earlier, caught his attention. He read aloud. "Beauregard Plantation, burned by Union troops, 1863. According to reports from Louisiana, the former Beauregard estate in St. James Parish was burned during a Union advance up the Mississippi. Colonel Silas Beauregard, a known Confederate officer, had reportedly abandoned the property months earlier to join the rebel forces. Union soldiers found the plantation operated by a skeleton staff. Buildings were put to torch after removal of useful supplies." Samuel fell silent, folding the paper carefully. Margaret reached across the table and took his hand. "The fire finished what we started," he said quietly. Margaret looked out the window toward the lake. 5 years, she whispered. Has it really been 5 years since we fled? 5 years, Samuel confirmed. Sometimes it feels like yesterday. Other times, like another life entirely, Margaret finished. They sat in silence, each lost in memory. The spring breeze stirred the curtains at the window. Outside, birds called to each other, busy with nests and new beginnings. I've been thinking, Margaret said after a while. When summer comes and your forge work slows, perhaps we could open a small school. Many of the children here have little education. We could teach reading, writing, figures. Samuel looked up, something lighting in his eyes. A school? Just a small one to start. We have the space in the back room. Margaret's voice grew more animated. I noticed Mrs. Cahill's children don't read yet, and they're nearly 10. And the Fisher children are bright, but have no books. Samuel smiled slowly. A school, he repeated, teaching others what we fought so hard to have ourselves. Something gentler than survival, Margaret said. Something that builds rather than escapes. As evening approached, they carried 2 chairs onto the small porch facing the lake. The setting sun turned the water to gold and pink. Margaret rested her head on Samuel's shoulder, watching as the first stars appeared in the darkening sky. Do you ever regret it? Samuel asked quietly. Leaving everything behind? Margaret shook her head against his shoulder. I left nothing of value except comfort, and gained everything that matters. Inside their cabin, on a small shelf next to their bed, sat their only luxury, a framed photograph they had taken in a Toronto studio the previous month. It showed not their faces, but their hands clasped together, his dark skin and her pale fingers intertwined. The photographer had found the request strange, but had obliged. It was the only picture they possessed, the only proof of their bond they dared to create. They'll never find us here, Samuel said, watching the stars reflect on the lake. Not as Beauregard and his slave? Not anymore. Margaret squeezed his hand. We vanished into the north, not as mistress and slave, but as souls who refused to live by chains ever again. The night settled around them, peaceful and free, as the last light faded from the western sky. I hope you found that story powerful. Leave a like on the video and subscribe so that you do not miss out on the next one. I have handpicked 2 stories for you that are even more powerful. Have a great day.